Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out here to the west of the Avdiivka in the direction of Tonenke. After the Russian full capture of the village of Tonenke, they now started moving westwards towards the Ukrainian fortifications and positions west of Tonenke. The Russians are going to be moving into directions here, both to the northwest in the direction of Umansk and the Ukrainian fortifications to the north, as well as in a western directions to bypass the Ukrainian fortifications here. The main brunt of the Ukrainian fortifications in the area are situated in a southern direction to avoid a Russian assault from the south. The fortifications were not built with the fall of Tonenke and Sheverna in mind. As such, the Russians can now bypass them and go around them to expand their zone of control to the north of these fortifications, likely looking to cut off their supply lines. To bypass the Ukrainian fortifications would allow the Russians to gain an edge in the fight over Nitailove and Pervomaiske. The main Ukrainian fortifications in this area is situated around the northern and southern flanks of Pervomaiske and Nitailove to prevent the Russians from flanking and bypassing the villages and towns of Pervomaiske and Nitailove. However, now that the Russians have captured Tonenke to the north, they can avoid the majority of the fortifications to the north and go straight to pressure Umansk and Yasnobrodivka here to the north, where the capture of these two villages would completely bypass the Ukrainian fortifications to the north, and flanking these fortifications as well as cutting off their supplies would allow the Russians to flank Nitailove and force the Ukrainians to withdraw from these fortifications, which would allow them to subsequently push further in a northern direction of Pervomaiske, avoiding the main parts or central parts of the town to go straight for Nitailove. As for the southern direction, we have a similar scenario with the Russians' capture of Nevelske. And this is one of the changes that has happened with the Russian army following their reorganization from small brigade and battalion sized units to now division and army corps sized units. The Russians are using and launching a coordinated attack all the way from the northwest of Avdiivka and down to Nevelske. This is all coordinated and done in unison and sync with each other, as the Russians are here in the whole front, looking to both capture the villages to the northwest of Avdiivka and push here to the south by Nevelske. All of this to reach the next line of defense of the Ukrainians, which goes here from the southeast of Pokrovsk, all the way down from the direction of Krasnohorivka to the southwest, through the reservoirs and lakes to the west of Avdiivka and up to Ocheretsine. The Russians are looking to gain control over everything east of this line, and this creates the scenario in which the Russians are launching coordinated attacks from the north to the south. The area of Krasnohorivka itself is currently not connected with the northern parts, as Russians are focusing their main force in front of the attack west of Avdiivka due to the Ukrainian reinforcements that arrived in the area to launch counterattacks. At the same time, these Ukrainian reinforcements and counterattacks left the southern parts vulnerable, and this is how the Russians managed to gain a foothold within Krasnohorivka. The southern parts of the Marinka, Peorivka, Krasnohorivka direction is an area of itself from Pobieda and north to the Krasnohorivka direction. Russians are largely just launching positional fighting and heavily bombarding the Ukrainian forces, but not actually pushing that heavily. The main reason for that is the Ukrainian reinforcements arriving to this area being heavily bombarded gives the Russian an advantage, as they are not that heavily fortified. We see the area here from Pobieda and to Hryvorivka, there are hardly any fortifications. That means additional Ukrainian reinforcements to the area are vulnerable. As for Krasnohorivka itself, the fighting has gone or bypassed the fortifications to the east and gone straight to the city itself, which is of course also fortified, but due to heavy shelling and bombardment over the past 2 years, it has become much more vulnerable. The Russians are heavily bombarding these areas, which has a lot of open fields, leaving their supply roads vulnerable as well, which means that they're trying to grind down the Ukrainian forces in these areas. So this is why we're seeing that the main advancement is focused around the area from Berdishi and to Nevelske. Here, the Russian objective is to prevent the Ukrainians from reorganizing in the next defensive line and to push them onto the third line rather than their second line. The fighting taking place here in the direction of Pervomaiske, Nevelske and Tonenke is one united attack, while in the northern parts it's mostly just positional, where they are trying to prevent the Ukrainian counterattacks from being successful and to capture these villages of Berdishi, Orlivka, and Tonenke. They've succeeded in capturing these two and leaving the northern parts by Berdishi and Semenivka as the next targets. What we're currently seeing is that the Russians are looking to bypass the fortifications and cut off the supply lines. This means that the Russians will likely look to attack in a northwestern direction from Nevelske after expanding their zone of control in all directions to prevent the Ukrainians from counterattacking and recapturing Nevelske. While at the same time, in the northern parts, they're looking to do the same, cutting off the supply lines and bypassing the fortifications. Then they will connect in the direction of Nitailova, both from the north, south, and from the east, to attacking from these three directions and reach the lakes and reservoirs here to the west of Nitailova. This way, the Russians would completely bypass the Ukrainian fortifications here between Pervomaiske and Nevelske, as well as between Pervomaiske and Tonenke. And it will also allow the Russians to create a buffer zone between the Russian positions in Donetsk and the next Ukrainian defensive line, which is west and many kilometers away from the city, which would prevent direct artillery fire from Ukrainian artillery. As for the northern parts, they're just relying on positional battles by Semenivka and Berdishi before they move westward, pushing the Ukrainians back to the next defensive line by pushing them first to Novoprokhovsk, Novoselivka, and then on to the next defensive line, which is by Oshiretene, after which they'll launch attacks by the railways in the northern direction to bypass the Ukrainian fortifications and go straight for the outpost or main defensive position, which is Oshiretene, located in the high ground, overseeing the whole defensive line and also the most fortified area. It is already being heavily bombarded by the Russians, both with FABs and also artillery and MLRS strikes. So the Ukrainian positions here are heavily bombarded and constantly under fire. But the main focus right now is the frontline villages and areas to push the Ukrainians on to the next defensive line. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here to the north of Ivanivske, the Russians have advanced, pushed the Ukrainians out of the fortifications to the north of Ivanivske and captured other fortifications, moving on to the next Ukrainian defensive line here to the east of Jazov Yar, and it is the final main line before the canal. If the Russians manage to capture this fortifications and defensive line, they'll reach the outskirts of Jazov Yar. At the same time, we see here to the north of Ivanivske, with the Ukrainians being pushed out of these fortifications, the Russians can now go down to the road and start pushing in a westward direction towards Ivanivske, where the Ukrainians have fortifications along the forest area, so the Russians may look to gain control over the northern parts and fortifications to the north to bypass these fortifications and attack the Ukrainian supplies, as well as avoiding the direct advantages of these fortifications by going through the forest area instead of going head on from the road. These fortifications were meant to push back the Wagner forces once they took control over the forest areas to the southwest of Ivanivske, pushing northwards to gain control over the road. With these fortifications, the Ukrainians were able to push back and defend the road when they were resupplying Bakhmut from that direction. But now that the Russians are attacking from the northern flank instead, they can bypass the effectiveness of these fortifications, gain control over the road, and push the Ukrainians out of the eastern bank of the canal. And with this, it is likely that the Russians will now restart operations to gain control over Ivanivske, the rest of it, with the majority of the fortifications to the north now being abandoned by the Ukrainians after a recent armored assault, allowing the Russians to gain control of it and pushing them to the next defensive line. We see that the Russians are constantly fighting here after a renewal of the offensive operations, where they first got control over parts of the railways to the east of Klishivka and now the fortifications to the north of Ivanivske. With the constant bombardment by the Russian Air Force on Ukrainian fortifications and positions, it becomes more and more difficult for the Ukrainians to hold on to these positions. Previously, I talked about how the Ukrainians are now taking way more casualties due to the heavy bombardments of the Russians, how the Russians have improved their tactics, the Ukrainian lack of ammunition, manpower, and fortification, all adding up to them taking, according to Russian sources, 3 times more casualties than they took last year, which was also according to Russian sources. The Russian sources claim 3 times as much as last year, while the Russians, according to Mediazona, are taking about 3 times less casualties, 3 times fewer casualties than last year, which has significantly improved the situation for the Russians and significantly deteriorated the position and situation for the Ukrainians. And with that comes this article from Politico about a dinner between Macron and some of his colleagues. We saw some leaks from this dinner conversation, which was very interesting. First, there is this quote, "Now is the time for commentary rather than mobilization. I would like that to change." Pretty much saying that there's too much talk, not enough mobilization. They need to mobilize their armies, need to mobilize their economies to deal with the Russians. And then he goes on to say, and I quote, "Ukraine can fall very quickly," he was quoted as saying by the first participant mentioned. This all is in regards to a deadline in April, pretty much saying that the Ukrainians need a lot of aid prior to April, because otherwise Ukraine can fall very quickly. They need aid in sense of weapons, of ammunition, they need manpower, and manpower is something he is willing to provide, but as he mentions above, now is the time for commentary rather than mobilization. He's saying that there's so much talk and people are not agreeing with him, despite him seeing the seriousness of the situation and how Ukraine can fall very quickly, and he seems to be the only one who cares. It seems that everything right now points towards that the Ukrainian situation will continue to deteriorate over the next months, even if new US aid to Ukraine is announced, which so far seems very unlikely considering how the Republicans and Democrats still cannot agree to pretty much anything regarding the new economic deal, and how Zelensky is about to lose legitimacy due to the lack of elections inside of Ukraine. And at the same time, the Russians are continuously building up their army, with an entire new army being built. There's going to be more and more quick fixes going into Ukraine over the next few weeks, like the Czech promise of 800,000 shells, which so far they're reporting 300,000 shells, but this has not been provided to Ukraine yet, but it is in the works to be provided to Ukraine. However, 300,000 shells is just a quick fix. It's not something that will help them in the long run. And if the Russians launch a massive offensive, the Ukrainians would be required to use a lot more than they're currently using, and that would quickly deplete their stock. It doesn't help that the Russian deep strike capabilities have improved as well. There is this article by The Atlantic, quoted a suspicious pattern alarming the Ukrainian military, where a source in the Ukrainian military that is anonymous claims that the Russians are buying satellite imagery from Western companies to allow them to correct their own strikes and hit important Ukrainian targets. However, this is very unlikely to be taking place, mainly due to the limitations in Western companies and their regulations as to who can buy what satellite imagery. I myself tested out this theory. I went to buy some satellite imagery, some commercial satellite imagery from Western companies, and what I got was here from the west of Avdiivka, between Orlivka, Semenivka, and Berdishi. I wanted to buy a very high quality satellite imagery. I was then told that this was not possible. The satellite company said it was not allowed, and that I could instead get a medium quality satellite imagery. I decided to go with it just to test out exactly how high quality the medium quality was, and I can tell you I have no clue about anything regarding this front line from that satellite image. It pretty much just shows the area and the burns and destruction there is, but I don't have any visuals on the fortifications, nor any visual over any units there may be in the area, and this makes it very difficult to use this, especially for deep strike capabilities, as you would need very high quality satellite imagery. So this is very unlikely to be true, and it's just some excuse to justify the Russian deep strike capabilities improving, because they have improved their own deep strike capabilities instead of having to resort to buying images from their opponents. And that sums up everything that's happening right now. We're seeing Russian pressure across the front line, heavy bombardment of Ukrainian positions. The Ukrainian position and situation and state of the battle is constantly on the decline. There's going to be a few more quick fixes, and the Russians are going to inflict heavy casualties on the Ukrainians prior to the start of their offensive, which could happen anywhere between the end of April to the start of June. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.